Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Style 3 method. So in previous lessons, we learned about the Style 1 method, which accepted no parameters. It was simply its own contained method which accomplished a specific task. A Style 2 method accepts a parameter, which means that you can take a value and send it down to the method so that you are able to access whatever is contained within it. And today we're going to talk about a Style 3 method, which does not accept a parameter, but it will um, return, sorry, a value or a number, which means that instead of sending a value down to the method from the main, we're doing the opposite. We're sending a value back to the main from the method. So what exactly does that look like? You'll notice over here we have a program which should be very familiar. This is a similar program to what we dealt with in the previous lesson, where we have a greeting method which prints out the word hi as many times as the user sends as an argument. So if I run this program, it runs the exact same as it did before. We print out the word hi 5 times, we enter a value between 1 and 10, and we print out the word hi again that many times. Despite the fact that this program accomplishes the exact same thing as the one from the previous lesson, it does look a little bit different. So let's take a look at the methods, the unique methods, before we take a look at our main method. I have my greeting method, which is pretty straightforward. I accept a parameter called x. It is an integer, and I print out the word hi x amount of times. However, I have added a new method, and this method is the premise of today's lesson because this is a Style 3 method. This method, the purpose is to allow the user to pick a number, and then it is going to send that number back to wherever you call this method from. So, since the purpose of this method is to return an integer, which is a number between 1 and 10, instead of writing public static void, that void needs to change to the data type of whatever value you will be returning. And you can only ever return one value. So in this situation, since we're returning an integer, which is a number between 1 and 10, instead of public static void, my definition of my method is going to be public static int. And then the name of the method, and then this method is going to have 2 empty parentheses because I will not be accepting any parameters. So to summarize the definition of a header, always public, always static. If you would like to return a value, you need to specify its data type, the name of your method, which is relevant camel case, and any parameters which you would like to accept. But in this case, we're accepting no parameters. Within this method, this should be familiar code. I create a scanner so the user can input a number. I have a do while loop, which is an error handling or an error trap that prompts the user to pick a number between 1 and 10 over and over. And then here's the key right here. If your method is not void, or in other words, if your method needs to return a value back to the main or wherever it is you called upon it, the method needs to end with a return statement. So at the end of this method, keyword return, and then the variable or the value which you will be sending back to your main or back to wherever you called upon the method. So I'm taking this number between 1 and 10 and I am returning it. So let's find an example of when I call upon this method, getNumber. You'll notice that when I click my cursor on getNumber, it highlights it in yellow. And then if I scroll up anywhere else in my code that getNumber appears, it will also highlight in yellow. So I can make these connections pretty easily. Now over here where I call upon getNumber, the purpose of this method is to pick a number between 1 and 10 and return it. Since I return a number between 1 and 10, you can imagine this highlighted method as simply being a number between 1 and 10 because the returned number takes the place of the method you are calling upon. So what's happening is I am taking the number between 1 and 10, and I am placing it within the variable response. Because if you return a value, you need to do something with it. And that something is usually placing it inside of a variable. All right. But you are usually either placing it inside of a variable or you can print it out directly. But what you cannot or should not do is something like this. So over here, I have a method that returns a number between 1 and 10, but I'm not doing anything with it. It's just sitting there in my code. So it doesn't matter that this method returns a number between 1 and 10 because it's kind of dissipating the moment that it returns back to my main. So I'm going to take that number, I'm going to place it inside of a variable called response. And then I can use that number further in my code because if I didn't want to use it, I shouldn't have returned it. So again, to summarize this code, I am saying hi 5 times by calling upon the greeting method with argument 5. I call upon the get number method, which returns a number between 1 and 10. I place that number between 1 and 10 inside a variable response. I then call upon greeting a second time, but I take the response, which is the number between 1 and 10, and I use that as a parameter, printing out the word hi that many times. So now that we understand the code, let's run this one more time. Over here, I call upon the greeting method with the parameter 5. Now I've entered the get number method where I'll pick a number between 1 and 10. I'm going to pick the number 1. So we can imagine that the number 1 is right here. And I take the number 1 and I place it inside of response. And then I take response, which now has 1, and I send that down to greeting, where greeting will print out the word hi 1 time. Once you get really used to working with methods, you can start taking really useful shortcuts. For example, in order to make this code more efficient, and it's okay if this doesn't make sense right now, we can actually cut out the middleman being the variable response. So what you can actually do is instead of taking the number 1, putting it in response, taking response, sending it to greeting, you can just take the number 1 or whatever number the user inputs, and you can put that directly in the parameter. And again, if that doesn't make sense right now, it's okay. But once you get used to methods, you will start being able to code things like this, where the user inputs a number and that number goes directly into the greeting method. And this will accomplish the exact same thing. As you see, my code works all the same. But I was able to take out 2 extra lines of code, and now my main is only 2 lines long, which is great. Now I believe that I have a more complicated program here for us to review. Let's take a look at what it is. Okay, perfect. So it looks like I have made a multiplication game here. Ooh, one last thing. Going back here, notice that if you are returning a variable, you need to specify that within your method header. Very similar to how we specified the @param, the @return is the exact same form. So make sure that your method header includes the name of the method, a brief description, as well as any parameters or returns that you have. You can have as many parameters as you want, but you can only return 1 value. So moving on to the second program, it looks like I have made a multiplication game. Let's just run it real quick to see how it works, and then we will look at the code. Let's practice our times tables. Answer the following questions correctly to win the game. Okay, makes sense. First question, what is 9 times 5? 45, correct. Next question, what is 4 times 9? Let's say I accidentally input the wrong answer. Sorry, you lost. You got 1 question correct. So it looks like this program is going to, oops. It looks like this program is going to continually count how many questions you got right until you get a question wrong, and then it will output the number of questions you got right. Now, let's take a look at how this works. Starting at my main method, I have my title, or rather my introduction, multiplication game, brief instructions, and it looks like I have a method called playGame, which presumably has the contents of the game, which would be to create two random numbers, to calculate their multiplication internally, prompt the user for their guess for the answer, compare that to the internal calculation, and keep count of how many times they have won. So after they're done playing the game, it looks like I am returning the amount of successes that they have gotten. I return the number of successes, place that inside a variable called wins, and then simply printed out how many wins they have and that they lost, because eventually they will lose. Now let's take a look at the play game. Okay. Yep, looks like I have num1, num2, all of my necessary variables in a scanner. I have a for loop, which interestingly enough has no really contents to its bounds. A for loop with two semicolons is going to run indefinitely. Okay, just like a while loop where the condition is always true, such as the raw Boolean value true, will also run forever, both doing the exact same thing. Now, within this loop, I pick a random number between 1 and 12, pick a random number between 1 and 12, and I internally calculate their the multiplication between the two, the product. Wow, it took me too long to think of that. I internally calculate their product and put that inside of answer. I then prompt the user with the question. Okay. I then prompt the user with the question and ask them to multiply the two random numbers. I take their guess, and if their guess is equal to answer, I say that is correct. Otherwise, I break. All right, and remember that keyword break will leave the current loop that you're in. So despite the fact that this loop will run forever, the moment that the guess does not equal the correct answer, I will break and I will leave the loop. Now, if I don't break, then I'm going to increase my count, which means I'm going to increase the number of correct answers. All right, and then I'm going to take count, which is the number of correct answers. Once they leave this loop, once they answer something incorrectly, I'm going to return that, which is an integer as specified in my method header. I'm going to take that, return it back to my main, where I am going to place it within the wins variable and plop that out for the number of wins or successes they had. All right. Again, once you get good with methods, you can cut out the middleman. We don't even need the variable wins if we place this method directly within my printout statement, and then the returned number of wins will appear directly on my screen. So this should work. If I get one win, yep, sorry, you lost. You got one question correct. The program works all the same, but it is slightly more efficient because I have one less variable, and that is that many less lines of code and that much less memory that it takes up. So please make sure you're reviewing this. Please make sure you're being careful with your method headers, and let me know that if you have any questions.